Hello and welcome to another episode of the Boring AppSec podcast. In this episode, I'm super excited to talk to Casey Ellis. Casey is a security industry veteran with more than 20 years of experience. In this conversation, Casey shares his personal journey through health challenges and his insights into the cybersecurity landscape. He discusses the evolution of the bug bounty industry, the importance of secure by default design, and the role of AI in both enhancing and complicating security measures. Casey emphasizes the need for accountability and the potential of crowdsourcing in security while also addressing the challenges of implementing effective standards. The conversation concludes with reflections on the future of AI in security and the necessity for focused problem solving in the industry. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Listen in. Welcome, Casey. I am super excited to have you here. Why don't you give me a quick rundown of what you've been up to recently, and then we can go from there.
What have I been up to recently? Yeah. So, hello. Thanks for having me. My name's Casey Ellis. I'm probably best known as the founder of BugCrowd, also the co-founder of the Disclose.io project. What have I been up to recently? That's a good question. I actually had a kind of an unexpected health issue midway through last year that kind of put me on, enforced sabbatical. So I've been sort of working my way back from that, kind of exploring what's happening in the world. Continuing to do a lot with BugCrowd on the strategy, the evangelism, and kind of the market side of things. But alongside that, really digging into what's happening in AI and kind of this convergence between AI security research and the overall kind of security environment, just in general. As well as a bit of angel investing and advisory stuff. One of the things that I've always loved and kind of got into pretty quickly after BugCrowd started working is this idea that like founding is hard. Like we're all learning things at a million miles an hour and getting stuff right and figuring some things out the hard way kind of along the way. So the opportunity to have folk come and sort of learn from some of my experience and the cool part about that is that I get to learn from them in terms of what they're seeing on the cutting edge. So that's kind of where it's been lately. Aside from that, bit of podcasty stuff here and there. I'm on the review board for Black Hat and DEF CON, so I've been kind of finding ways to keep myself busy as I've been sort of recovering out of the surgery stuff, and yeah, that's sort of where it's up to.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I had no idea that you were going through some kind of a health issue, but I hope you're well. Like, you
Yeah, no,
look
I
really well.
appreciate it. I mean, just a quick double click on that. I had I
Yeah.
had to have basically open heart surgery midway through last year. So I had a genetic issue that we figured I'd gotten away with that it turned out I hadn't. And it was, definitely not on the bingo card, but ended up on the operating table in July of last year and then had to go back in August. So, everything's worked out well in terms of the surgery stuff, and I'm super grateful for that. But like the recovery time from that sort of surgery is not trivial. So it's been a balance of like trying to keep myself entertained and get back into what's happening in the industry and building and all that other stuff, and obviously treating recovery with the right kind of respect. Yeah.
Yeah, no, man, I appreciate you hanging in there and you look fine.
Yeah. Thank you.
Uh,
Appreciate it.
I am glad that things are on the mend, which is always nice. So, awesome. So Casey, I had some questions for you.
Yeah.
I have uh, for the audience to get some context. I've known you for a long time now. I think I was probably one of the first early researchers on the Bugcrowd platform
Yep.
when you and Jake Ran and a few others came up with this idea of crowdsourcing bug hunting.
Yep.
And I was really fascinated by it because I was into security and the idea of getting paid to find security vulnerabilities just proved like too good to be true. So, I appreciate the fact that you've basically created an entire industry,
Thank you.
like over
Yeah.
these years, and you continue to
Yeah, no, and
champion the
I do remember that too, like, back in the very early days, like,
yeah,
bumps and scratches trying to figure out how all of this works, and you're kind of part in that, so I appreciate that on your end as well. Your
yeah,
patience,
no,
guys.
absolutely, man. I think the entire bug bounty industry, has a lot of gratitude to you and others who have basically started this industry, and I've seen people's lives change because of the amount of stuff that they can do with all of the awards and
Yeah,
whatnot. So again, thank you so much. We really appreciate
appreciate
it.
that.
So, in terms of your founder's journey, right? Like you've been a founder, you've founded Disclose.io, like you mentioned. You've obviously founded BugCrowd.
Yep.
Uh, I'm kind of curious to know how your founder's journey has been, like things that you've learned over the years, things that you wish you did differently, and things that you wish changed in the way our industry works. Just kind of feel free to go at it, take different
Yeah,
angles in it.
yeah. I mean, it's a super broad question because yeah, like I've been I've been at the bug crowd thing now for what are we 2025? We kind of kicked it off in 2012, so 13 years. Um, Bug crowd's not actually my first rodeo from a founding standpoint. I have done businesses prior, but it was the first time I kind of took a swing at like let's invent a category, let's kind of try to disrupt a problem at a system level, and then obviously the venture backing and all the stuff that kind of comes with that, or that we kind of executed on that journey. A lot of that I had to learn very rapidly for the first time. I think the thing is, once you've in the early stages, like we didn't invent bug bounty or vulnerability disclosure programs. Like that dates back to like Netscape in like 1995 and prior. Um, but having come from the hacker community and sort of understanding the mechanics of vulnerability research and just how vulnerable things are, really the problems that I wanted to solve, it was two things. One is like, how do I and the early team, obviously, because it wasn't just me doing the thing. I scribbled on the napkin, but it's ultimately the team that makes this whole thing happen, right? How do I change the operating environment for hackers that work in good faith? Because I think prior to bug bounty, this notion of a hacker being potentially good was not really a thing out there in the broader kind of, even in the security industry. I think there was a subset of the security industry that got it at that point in time, but everyone else had just assumed that if you could hack a computer, you were probably a bad person. So like that makes helping really difficult. And I wanted to basically, throw a wrench in that and actually create an operating environment with folks that can do security research that makes things safer, give them the ability to operate without a chilling effect, and with better understanding of what they're doing from the industry as well. So that was one part of it. The other side of it was this idea that, like, as defenders, really, when you think about it, like the entire reason we're here is because of the bad guys, right? Like if they packed up and went home, we could arguably like all pack up and go on vacation ourselves. Like they're sort of the leader of why we're all here as a defensive industry, and they're creative. It looks like a crowd. It looks like people that are incentivized for results. It looks like people that have an incredibly like diverse array of skills and motivations and all those different things. And meanwhile, we were trying to compete against all of that creativity and resourcing with like a single pen tester being paid by the hour, or whatever automation's available at the time. And I was looking at that problem, running a pen test company at the time and just thinking like, this is stupid. Like this is like the math is wrong. Do you know what I mean? It's not got to do with how skilled or unskilled the individual pen testers or the teams are. It's the fact that they've got to outsmart all of this, they're just not going to be able to do that. So meanwhile, you've got this entire kind of security research community sitting behind all of that, kind of waiting for their invitation to the table, and kind of the idea behind bug crowd originally was like just to plug those things in and kind of normalize it. So that I think, speaking about the founder journey and all of that kind of stuff, like it was a pretty hairy, audacious vision at the time, because we had to literally like reform the opinion of hackers, turn like hackers from being this sort of like toxic, scary thing to something that's potentially a product that companies can consume, and that actually being the precursor for like productive engagement, right? That was a big boat to turn around. Um, and yeah, like, I think probably the big thing, that I talk about with founders a lot these days is that there's no shortage of opportunities to chase a quick win in cybersecurity. Like there's definitely a lot of kind of short win money to be made in basically putting band-aids on broken arms, right? And you've seen me rant about that on LinkedIn more than once. But this idea of like if you're trying to attack a fundamental problem, like developing just a irrational conviction around what the future should look like. Testing that and making sure that you're not kind of smoking crack and off in fairyland with that conviction. But if it's valid, if it's real, then like really kind of almost marrying that thing and going all in. That I think conviction is the thing that can take you through like the bumps and wobbles and the hard times and the good times that sort of follow, especially when it gets going. And I think that's a really important thing. And it's ultimately the thing that your team will follow as well, right? Like there's a leadership component to that in terms of your ability to actually present that vision and have people like adopt it and run with it. So yeah, those are a few thoughts on that side. You asked about 5 different questions, and I kind of launched into some backstory, so we might come back
No,
to
no,
that.
I think this is awesome. So yeah, I think you definitely shared uh, things about your journey and things that you've learned. Curious to know how you think about uh, the things that currently exist in the industry, especially when it comes to security vendors. Like trying to sell products that might not necessarily bring value to teams, but they're still vendors, right? At the end of the day. So yeah, just kind of walk me through how your mental model has evolved over the years, right? With
Yeah.
respect to what really works and what doesn't really work.
Yeah, that's a great question because I think, like, there is this sort of, sales and marketing trope that it's not even a trope, it's actually, I think, good advice, but when you apply it to cybersecurity, it gets a bit weird, like, the whole idea of, like, sell pain pills, not vitamins, right? Like, if you're trying to sell, if you're trying to create a product that you're trying to fit out to a problem that you see in the market, you've gotta, attach it to some sort of pain or some sort of urgency. Um, and I think that's absolutely true because people don't buy stuff unless they feel like they really should or need to, right? But the problem is that if you just do that, then you end up kind of doing, that thing that I was just talking about before. It's like, I'm gonna create a Band-Aid for a broken arm. Um, I do believe that in security just in general, and this is really a product of, like, hacking the internet at scale for the last 12 or 13 years, like, it's the fundamentals that are screwing us, right? Like, it's not, all of the fancy things that we talk about on the edges and whatever else, like, those all matter, but it really is the basics, and the need to make, secure easy and insecure obvious that we've sort of failed at, I think, as a security industry just in general. And I think, the kind of founders that I like to work with, and that kind of, I'll back from like an angel investor, invest in, sorry, an angel investment or an advisory standpoint, are the ones that actually want to go after the root cause. It's like, let's try to alter the fundamentals of the math that we're dealing with here when it comes to defense. And that's hard to do because on top of that, you've got people that like want to treat their headache and you're trying to sell them vitamins. So you got to figure out how to market that, how to position it into use cases, how to, take the success of that and create reference marketing, like network effect virality, all those different things. Yeah, which, all of those things I've had exposure to, and I've kind of had the opportunity to lead throughout the course of building BugCrowd because it was an absurd idea at the outset. The folks that were looking at it's like that's never going to work. People aren't going to accept the feedback of hackers. Like, rah, it's we're not that vulnerable anyway. There was all of these different objections, and I kind of knew all of those were wrong, and I had the conviction to press through that, and had the team with the same conviction to actually support that. But in the middle of that, you've got to actually take this sort of big picture and then sort of distill it back to things that folk can access in the present as well. Yeah, so going back to your question, I do feel like the industry has a really kind of short, like a fairly narrow focus on whatever sells best in the short time frame and whatever can sort of, you know, demonstrate the greatest kind of hockey stick of growth. That's important, but I don't think it's the only thing, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah. No, actually, I'm glad that you hit this sort of point of we're not necessarily making secure things easier, and we're
Yeah.
not making the insecure things obvious. I
Yeah.
think I really believe in that, and I think this is also a good segue into my next question I had for you.
Shoot.
Uh, More about the secure by design space, right? So, as a practitioner myself, having been in the industry, having worked for multiple enterprise and early stage companies, one thing I've realized is that uh, folks generally want to buy certain things or try to solve problems that they see in the industry. They don't necessarily try to analyze the root cause of why this is a
Yeah.
problem in the first place, right? So
Yep.
this is where the whole secure by design comes in, right? Where yes, I think people are still trying to uh, make sure that their dust tooling, their programs are effective. And that is essentially scanning for vulnerabilities in code that is already shipped, right? Now, if you really try to analyze all of the, issues that you see in your program, and if you try to identify trends and see if there's a significant root cause that could be addressed that eliminates entire vulnerability classes, I think there's much more value there, right? I think this is where the world I see more evolving towards, because as an application security engineer myself, I don't want to be dealing or triaging the same kind of vulnerabilities day in, day out,
Yeah.
right? I want my mental
You
sort
wanna
of
you wanna
ability.
ideally improve if you can, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, but on the flip side, at least from my experience for the past few months, I found out that it's really difficult to sell or build a product in this space when it's not quite obvious that it is what needs to be solved in the first place. Like,
Yeah.
folks and companies are still dealing with vulnerabilities. They want a solution to manage them, but they're
Yeah.
not really thinking about, okay, why are these vulnerabilities getting introduced in the first place? Can we do something about it? So,
Yeah.
you've built companies, you sort of come up with this idea of crowdsourcing, right? So I'm curious to see how you think about, like, if you were to crowdsource a company in the secure by design space, how would you go about it?
Yeah. Okay. So specifically thinking about crowdsourcing around secure by design, I think because I agree with everything you just said. I think the other piece that often gets missed is this idea that like security practitioners greatly overestimate the ability for normies, so to speak, to think about risk and process the prioritization around risk in the way that we do. So the fact that we can just identify something that is like non-compliant or violates an SPD principle, um, I don't even think that's necessarily enough. I think there's this aspect of like reducing the cost of that feedback loop to as little as you possibly can, so that you can fix things like in code pre-production or even fix things in the IDE. I think that's like an approach that I think AI has actually opened up a lot of opportunity to provide that feedback real time to developers. And there's some companies that I work with that are taking that approach, and I think that's an approach that's sort of dawning on the zeitgeist at the moment, which is kind of cool. But the other side of it is like, why do we care? Like, why is this actually important? Like, are we able to like properly articulate to the person who's ultimately signing the check to go through the additional inconvenience to do things securely, why they should do that? Um, and I think we've sort of rested a little bit on this idea that like, oh, cool, people get security now, so like we should just tell them what's wrong and they'll just automatically understand why that's important and go off and fix it. And I don't think that's right. Like I don't think that's accurate. Or actually, even better put, I don't think that's a resilient kind of like market thesis for the security industry. And you can see the evidence of that over the past couple of years as there's been kind of economic headwinds, and a lot of this stuff has sort of gotten deprioritized in the process. So, okay, there's a sales and marketing issue in there somewhere, right? And there's a value story problem that we're missing. This is why I rant about marketing a lot in context of security, because like you don't go through the expense and the effort and the pain of putting up bars on your windows unless you know that you live in a bad neighborhood, right?
Yeah,
And that whole moment of realizing you live in a bad neighborhood, that happens because you've been broken into, it's because your neighbor's been broken into, or because you've been at the local coffee shop or bar or whatever, and you've heard a story that helps you actually realize that that's an important thing to do. So that to me, that last part is the bit that we're sort of missing in terms of prioritization of like vulnerability discovery, mitigation, avoidance, full stop. And where I think the crowd comes into that is this idea of being able to demonstrate, this is how easy it is to actually exploit this stuff. Like crowdsourcing the idea of trying to create this story of what a bug is actually worth. Because as defenders, our job is basically, in my mind, if you like boil it all the way down, it's to increase the cost of attack to the point where the kind of adversary you're likely to face, it becomes economically irrational for them and they go somewhere else,
that's
right?
right.
This whole
Yeah.
idea that like you can reduce vulnerabilities to zero, I think that's a fool's errand. I think the market's starting to properly cotton on to that now, but it begs the question, well, now what, right? Um, and I think using the crowd to be able to actually help them really understand like how easy or how inexpensive it might be to exploit, failures, anti-patterns, vulnerabilities in the systems, and then what kind of potential economic damage they can do in the process. I think that's something that crowdsourcing's, obviously I'm sort of bringing it back to a bug bounty use case, which is not the goal here, but I've seen that kind of be a byproduct of bug bounty in a lot of organizations that I've worked with over the years. And I do think that sort of feedback loop, like, hi, we're your friendly neighborhood, like locksmith, like we could be a burglar, but we're not. But let's tell you about, what we would do if we had malicious intent. I think that's a really important kind of step in the process. It's probably missing right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100% agreed. I think the simplest example I can think of is uh, a lot of companies have bug bounty programs these days, right? And
Yeah.
uh, I'm pretty sure most of them they don't go the extra mile and they try to analyze the root cause. Okay, so they keep seeing
Yeah.
the same kind of issues every
Yeah.
day. But have you ever taken a step back and considered, okay, what can we do about it to eliminate this class? Nobody does
Yeah.
that. Just because we're still in that,
I
there's a
think I
fire,
think
we
I
have to
think
deal with
some
it.
do, but I completely
They
agree
do.
for
Yeah.
the better part they don't. And if pressure comes on that team to deliver things quickly, or if pressure comes on that team to kind of reduce the cost of delivery, then those lessons can have a tendency to go out the window pretty quickly. Um, so yeah, no, I fully agree with that part. I mean, I think the other part here is that like we're talking all about stick and like this
Yeah.
is scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, the reason like I worked with Jack and Bob and a bunch of folk on the CISA side of things around the development of secure by design, and there's a component in there that includes vulnerability disclosure programs and safe harbor being included in that, and it draws a lot from Disclosure, which I worked with them on around election security and a bunch of stuff in 2020. Um, I think the reason that it didn't I think everything that's in the CISA SBD kind of document is they're the right set of things to be working on. And this goes back to that idea of like, we can't, like, let's not worry about trying to figure out how to cure cancer until we've figured out how to remind everyone to wash their hands after they use the restroom. Like, let's do the fundamentals first because like they're lower cost as a lesson and they're probably the likelihood of them actually creating an issue is higher in the process, and it's just economically rational to approach it like that. I think they're all the right things, but I think why it didn't necessarily get the traction that it could have is that there's no penalty for saying that you were going to do it, and not doing it. And I don't necessarily think there was a strong enough kind of reward out to the public market to say, hey, this organization is more mature. Like, we're not like attesting to its security or any of that other stuff. But what we are saying is that based on these things, they actually are ahead of the pack when it comes to security maturity. So therefore, as a user, be it consumer or
Yeah.
B2B, you
Yeah.
can, if you're factoring that into how you're buying stuff, like you might want to look into these guys as a less risky option and actually
Yeah.
creating kind of a positive feedback loop on the on the market
Yeah.
side. I think that's
Yeah.
a missing piece as well.
No, absolutely, 100% agreed. I when CISA came up with this this whole secure by design, I saw a few companies like sign the pledge, and I think Okta is one of the few companies I've seen who are actually sharing how they are working towards that pledge, which is very good to see, right? Because we need more such enterprises that come out and say like, look, we signed this pledge.
Yeah.
This is how we are working towards it, and I don't see that enough of. So I think it makes a lot of sense from that perspective. Um, there
I
was
think
one other
I
thing.
think you
Yeah,
can
go
you
ahead.
can crowdsource accountability. So going back to your question of how would you bring
Yeah,
crowdsourcing into that?
yeah, yeah,
This to me is one of the fundamental things around vulnerability disclosure in particular. Like forget about bounty and just think about see something, say something. It
yeah,
invites feedback and accountability from the outside world in a way that like kind of demonstrates transparency and maturity inside that
yeah,
organization. I think if you apply that out into going and looking for specific things that sit within kind of an SPD framework, um, that could be an approach there.
yeah. I think one thing that I've been thinking about quite a bit is so how there are different compliances. There's like SOC. to
Yeah.
this HIPAA.
Yep.
Some companies do these things because there's a compliance mandate, right? With secure by design, there are things like OWASP ASVS, Application Security Verification Standard. It is,
Yeah.
I think, in their fifth version or something. But I wasn't quite sure, and maybe I'm just curious, like why weren't these standards mentioned in that secure by design? Because if we start saying that, look, you can get to a secure by design state if you start considering the ASV standards for each application that you build, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts around that as to why that didn't happen?
Yeah. N- Not to speak too far out of school on that one because I want to be respectful of that. But um, as a general design principle, I think a lot of the thought that went into the CISA SPD document was to make it as kind of simple, this whole idea of like simple is strong, right? Like if the fundamentals of what are trying to be achieved are there and you haven't kind of reduced them down to things that don't matter anymore,
Yeah,
but you're removing as much kind of prescriptiveness and complexity north of that as you can, kind of recognizing the fact that, everyone's going to have their own snowflake approach to doing this thing because every company's different. Every application's different. Like ASVS, I know Dan and some of the folk that work on that really well, and like they work their asses off on trying to make it as broadly applicable as they possibly can, but it's not 100% because there's just edge cases that pop into the mix and create a problem. So to say
yeah,
that if you don't meet this bar according to this particular standard, you therefore fail, it kinda
it's
trips the whole
probably a
thing
bit
up,
harsh.
right? So if you just bring it
Yeah.
back to the fundamental and say, "No, do this thing," there's lots of different ways to do it, but make sure that you're doing the core thing and demonstrating improvement there. I think that was a lot of the design kind of theory that got applied to the creation of that document.
Yeah, no, I think I've heard the same argument from multiple people is that saying that you can build secure by design, saying things like you can eliminate entire vulnerability classes is easier. But when you actually start doing it in practice,
It's
you
hard.
don't, yeah, you don't
Yeah.
realize the disparity of systems, the heterogeneous environments that companies have, especially
Yeah,
big enterprises. And
yeah.
it's so difficult to address each and every edge case, each and every nuance.
Well, yeah, and you call out an important thing there as well is that we do, especially like if we've been kind of, bouncing around Silicon Valley for any period of time, right? Like there's different kind of technology generations of attack surface that we're dealing with here, and I don't think particularly kind of the cloud and the AppSec and now kind of the AI security group as well,
Yeah,
necessarily consider the fact that like the bulk of the infrastructure that runs the internet is like 20 plus years old. Like it's not,
yeah,
like
mainframes.
CI/CD pipelines and all these kind of fancy ideas that we kind of throw around as just the easy solution to the problem. Like they don't have that available to them because they've got
Yeah,
this massive incumbent set of infrastructure that they can't just bolt that stuff on top of, right? Um, so again, like this idea of like how do you bring it back to the principle that could be useful for those kind of more like legacy larger organizations, but also can be applied. The easiest way to do this stuff is if you're building something from scratch and you can just build it in from the ground up, right? But not everyone
right.
gets to do that. So it's,
That's
how,
true.
how do you kind of, come up with a solution that applies across the entire spectrum of attack surface, not just the kind of the shiny new stuff.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think it all resonates with me, and based on what I've heard and for experience, yeah, I think it's the right direction to go towards. However, how we get there, the implementation, the devil is in the details of the implementation,
As
and I
always.
think each company is a snowflake, like you mentioned, and yeah, it's kind of very difficult to solve it across the industry, across different verticals, right? There's
Yeah.
healthcare, there's financial,
So you gotta bring
so
it back to the primitive and just make sure that everyone understands that and that everyone is at least directionally working towards that. Because if they can demonstrate continuous improvement, then all of a sudden, we're all
yeah,
getting better as a whole at that point.
yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah.
it makes sense. Um, cool. I want to quickly jump, topics here. I want to see what you think about AI and how AI has
Drink. Yeah.
had this huge impact on both sides, security for AI and AI for security. So yeah, just feel free to go at it. How you think is AI impacting, whether it's good or not, and how do you see us in the next 6 months to a year?
Yeah, Good or not is an interesting question because I think like I view the overall impact of AI on AppSec in particular, but just, if you think about like system level, like information security and cybersecurity as a whole, I don't necessarily see it having. I don't sort of see it as an independent actor in that sense. It's more that it's gonna basically surface a whole bunch of shit that we've been trying to solve for a really long time and kind of make the obviousness of those things way
Right.
more kind of clear. Um, because it's an accelerator. Like that's literally what it does. It speeds absolutely everything up. Like when when ChatGPT first dropped, I was doing some work with the White House 301CD on creation of the national cyber strategy and then the AI executive orders. And it was funny because when it dropped, it's like, everyone just kind of freaked out all at the same time. They're like, this is super scary and powerful and like really exciting. And all of like the upside was obvious, right? But because it was so obviously powerful and because it was usable by anyone, regardless of their skill level, it became an issue of retail politics like really, really quickly. So of course, your legislators, like their immediate reaction to that is we've got to write stuff to make sure that this is safe, which is what happens. But yeah, the thing that was interesting that came out of that was, people were saying like we need to write policy around AI security. And if I'd asked them what they meant by that, like no one could really give a straight answer. It's like, oh, we're worried about this particular aspect of it, like bias and the data
Right.
side, or we're worried about it being used as tools in the hands of the adversary, or all those different things. So I cooked
Right.
up this taxonomy of basically AI as a tool, AI as a target, and AI as a threat. So AI as a tool is basically the use of AI to decrease time to success for attackers or defenders. Um, AI as a target is really all of this kind of net new stuff that's exploiting LLMs and kind of AI systems themselves. So prompt
Right.
injection, like bias, monkeying about, and like different things that can happen there, all that kind of stuff. And then AI as a threat is kind of the unintended consequences that come from integrating this stuff into what we've already got and how we already think, right? Um, I think the last one, honestly, is the one that kind of I would say it's bad in the sense that, like, anytime a new technology stack hits the market and there's a ton of pressure behind it, and then everyone competes to integrate that thing into what they're doing, it's like a
MCP,
yeah, MCP. But I mean, you go back historically, you think about IoT as a really good
IoT. Oh yeah. Oh
as a
my
really
God.
good example,
I still remember those
right?
programs on Buckcrowd. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
so
Go on.
you think about sort of in
Yeah.
reverse this same phenomena. You've got this new, like,
Yeah.
flashy, like, technology that's, like, genuinely awesome and transformative, but what happens is that all of the people that wanna use it, you know, get really busy just cramming it into whatever they can, because it becomes competitive, right? And then, security is kind of well, security is the child of quality, and quality, and haste don't tend to play nice together, right? So it's just you end up kind of accumulating technical debt that you end up having to pay back in some sort of trash fire in the future. And like the Mirai botnet was a really good example of that with IoT. Yeah, there's been a bunch of similar things that have happened with cloud, like Docker and kind of infrastructure as a service had a similar phenomenon. I think it's no different for AI. Um, so yeah, the fact that like we're not very good at providing like design and implementation feedback, early in the development process. I think AI is going to really accelerate the obviousness of that. Like the good news is that I also think that it's a really powerful tool to actually help solve that problem to some degree. Um, but I think overall it's kind of bad on that side. And you see like yeah, you see a lot of different examples of that. Like on the as a tool piece, I think it was last week, there was a CVE that dropped that actually got found by Expo, who are doing like AI pen test,
Yes.
focused on web
Yeah.
apps like Oosh and Nico and all those guys, which are they're
Right.
awesome.
Yeah.
But they found basically it's an XSS that can be triggered by rewriting a URL. Like it's bad design, and then it's vulnerable to
Right.
implementation, to um, sanitization issues, in terms of how it gets passed on the back end. in
Mm.
a Palo Alto Networks firewall around a VPN. And like AI found that, and then it got picked up and dumped into a nuclei template. And at the moment, like every man and their dog are just spraying the internet trying to find this thing. So like I think the frequency of that type of event is gonna increase, and that's old
Right.
code. That's not new code,
Yeah.
the Palo Alto firewall. So
Yeah.
there's just a whole bunch of different things that were already sort of broken that I think are gonna become more obviously broken, and we're gonna have to think differently about how we solve those problems going forward.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a very good point. Is we are still dealing with SQL injections, cross-site scripting.
Yeah.
Those things are not going to go away. I think they're only going to get magnified and much easier to find. And
Yep.
then this is just the old issues. When we think about the new issues that AI brings, right? Prompt injection, uh, context stealing, whatever it is, the different attacks that are coming up pretty much every day about
Yeah.
how different MCP servers are getting exploited and whatnot. I think the world, especially from a security angle, I don't know how I feel about it. It just feels like we have to do better as an industry and focus more on what really matters, which is building secure systems to begin with, right?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah. I think that's right. I think, like, because part of part of my job is to, like, do, like, stochastic analysis, right? So you take sort of data points and try to infer a future trend based on,
mm,
like, a limited set of information. So you don't necessarily have a trend yet, but you can kind of extrapolate where things are going.
so
And, just really seeing around corners, that's like the founder gig, I think, in a lot of ways. One of the things that, where it keeps on driving me back to this whole idea of attacker versus defender economics is that, like, historically, as defenders, we've identified a problem or identified like a systemic weakness or threat, come up with a defense to that. And if we're successful in implementing that defense, then the attackers are like, this is too hard. And they come up with something else, right? And there's this sort of cat and mouse thing that goes on that sort of defines, I think, a lot of how we prioritize security just in general. And it's not just cyber, like that happens in the real world too, right?
yeah,
Um, the thing that's happening with AI is that, like, that kind of OODA loop, like the, observe, orient, decide, act. I think traditionally it's been kind of long enough for people to fit into the middle of it and figure out what's going on and start to predict what's going to be
mm,
needed in the future. I see that loop getting so tight that we kind of can't anymore. At which point we've got to think about, like, what's the actual economics of what we're doing here? Like, what's the economics of attack for the adversary, and how do we start to, like, impact that on their end? Like, how do we take the fight back to the bad guys, within reason? But thinking about that as a system level thing is like we're just probably going to end up needing to go in that direction because the things that we do right now are going to fail to work at some point in the future. So yeah, there's some interesting kind of thought experiments there, but that's a lot of what I've been sort of, thinking about in my spare time over the past little bit.
interesting. Yeah, you spoke about Expo. I've been
Yeah.
following Expo's journey.
Yep.
Pretty closely. I think it's fascinating to. I think I just saw yesterday or maybe day before yesterday that they are the number one on the US leaderboard last month or something like that.
Yeah.
So that it basically shows, and this is like a real world bounty programs. They are no longer sort of the VDP leaders anymore. Um, I think the whole industry is was very fascinating to begin with. Now I think it's even getting more interesting, right? Like the fact that autonomous agents, hack agents, go and
Yep.
find vulnerabilities, exploit them, create reports, all of that stuff is pretty wild to me, right? So
Yeah.
I guess my question to you is, as one of the founders of the leading bug bounty platforms out there,
Yeah.
how do you see this sort of impacting the bug bounty industry and just the offensive security industry in general?
Yeah. I get asked this a lot because yeah, there's definitely, like, it's gonna, I mean, the net will be that it will trigger a, um, a need to up level, I think, across,
Skills.
yeah, the entire bounty community, and the entire vulnerability research community, just full stop, right?
Mm,
Um, if you're playing that particular game, where I don't necessarily think it's gonna, like, make the entire, like, bounty space irrelevant overnight is that, like, there's, Salt Typhoon did their thing using like Enday in, you know, edge access equipment, right? Like there's still a lot of vulnerabilities that have been reported to organizations and have either been fixed and not been deployed out into the wild, or haven't been fixed because they're just on the queue somewhere or whatever else. Finding the bug is not the only part of the problem that we need to kind of address here, right? So this
Mm,
that aspect of it, I think, I think the space itself and what people as program owners see as being valuable, I can see kind of incentives shifting around to think more about the behavior of threats more than just kind of the enumeration or identification of vulnerabilities. So there's that. But yeah, on the actual like skills competition side, it's everything I've seen out of there's a bunch of different vendors playing in this space now. Like Expo is definitely, I think, the kind of the noisiest and sort of the furthest along from a funding and execution standpoint. And like Uj, the founder there, he's the guy who wrote SEML, which eventually
Somehow
became,
GitHub. Yeah.
Copilot.
Yeah.
So like that dude knows what he's doing from a CEO standpoint. He's a great guy too. So like there's all of
Yeah.
these things in the mix. But then in the meantime, you've got all of these different students coming out of universities writing papers on
Mm,
similar things. You've got, different sort of versions of Expo kind of popping up all over the place. And the thing to me that they all have in common is that they they sort of lack the creativity um, to go kind of second or third order with vulnerabilities that are more difficult to reproduce, right?
I
Like they're
see.
really
I
they're
see.
really good at the bug that I just mentioned. Like you've got like a URL with an instruction in it, and they went through that URL and tried to figure out like how they could get XSS to fire. Once they found something, they then doubled down on that vector to see what could be done from an impact standpoint. Like that's cool. Like that's really creative, and I don't want to diss that, but you don't need to know that much as a security researcher to get to a point where you're able to do that type of research. It's just that like this stuff is able to do it very quickly at scale without sleeping, all that kind of thing. So I sort of see it
Right.
kind of clearing off the bottom tier of bugs when it comes to
Right.
complexity, and ease of discoverability, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, thinking about like vulnerabilities or attack chains that require more context, for example, like just as a practical AI limitation, like context windows are a thing, right? So if you've got multiple systems interacting with each other and you're trying to exploit their relationships, it's going to be a while before AI gets good at that, for example, and it's going to need focused effort, towards that particular type of problem before you'll see a system pop out that can just kind of walk through the park and get that done. And I think it's just going to be an evolution of that over time. So
Yeah.
yeah, for hunters, like understanding how this stuff works, making sure you're using it in your own workflows. I think the biggest piece is just getting AI native. If you're in security research, like if you're kind of treating this like a fad or treating it like a thing that's not that relevant or whatever,
Mm,
then I don't think that's a safe assumption in terms of,
yeah.
what you can do in the future, and getting comfortable with it's probably the best idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. I've tried to build a few hacking agents myself, and I was mind blown at how easy these things have become. Like anybody can just do things
Yeah.
now. Like there's no longer restricted by to go find an expert to go speak to. Like ChatGPT, Claude, all of these sort of services, they're there to train you, to teach you. And I think using them in a way to actually enhance your skills as opposed to just kind of ask them questions and copy paste that I think so there's a fine line here,
Yeah.
and how to use AI systems effectively versus how to
Yeah.
just kind of. So
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating, and I think from what I've heard from you now is there's a lot of competition, especially in the offensive security sort of AI native space, and I think what will really matter is how you differentiate by. Um, how deep can you really go, like the second or the third order sort of
Yeah.
vulnerabilities, right?
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah, well, and I mean, even, what kind of like, what is the use case? What are the things that you're gonna develop an expert at doing? 'Cause, like, I do think a lot of the offensive solution stuff that's come out, over the past while has tried to be it's tried to sort of take from like, oh yeah, I'm talking to Claude and I can ask it anything and it can tell me the thing. And it's better at certain things, but it's kind of a generalist. People have been trying to build out solutions that sort of mimic that. I don't think like AI is a long way off being good at that. So the whole idea of like, yeah, I want to have something that, that example that I just gave before, like understand the full context of all of the systems within an environment, understand their communication and trust contexts, and then go off and exploit those. Like that's a very specific thing to do, right? So actually building for those use cases or use cases that look like that, I think I don't know, for folks that are building in that domain, that's how I'd be thinking about it. Because, a mixture of agents and mixture of experts approach with a particular, goal, or a particular kind of strategy in mind that might have multiple different paths within it, but you've got this sort of set of guardrails that you're trying to build around and follow. Those approaches seem to be the most effective. So,
Yeah,
like, we'll just see more and more of those pop up, I guess, is what I predict there.
yeah, no, absolutely. Um, I think Apple released a paper, I think last week or maybe the week before that, about this illusion of thinking, where I think the gist was that they don't think LLMs are good at reasoning, right? And then I've seen arguments on both sides.
Yeah.
I've played with some of these models myself. I'm just kind of curious to know, what is your take on that? Like, can LLMs really reason? And do you think, these offensive sort of security, automated security platforms using AI, they can actually find some 0 days and whatnot? Because I still haven't seen any company finding 0 days day in day out. Right? They're
Yeah.
finding stuff in open source stuff, and they're finding stuff that are low hanging fruit, so to speak, but haven't seen any groundbreaking sort of discovery. I know there were a few blogs. There was one by Project Zero, I believe, and then there was a new CV recently released, which was mostly done by reverse engineering using AI, right? So
Yeah.
I've seen those kind of use cases, but I haven't seen a company or a vendor or a tool kind of claim that they can find 0 days every day. So yeah, just kind of curious to know your thoughts on how this space is evolving.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work going into that, and I think there's like the progress that's coming out of the work that's going into that is probably not turning up in papers at the moment. Is
Mm,
probably one thing that I'd call out there because there is definitely um research and build around this type of problem happening inside like larger organizations, right? And I think there's a lot of work around solving these types of problems happening on the high side and kind of defense and military and the intelligence community as well. So the true state of the art, I think, yeah, for the purpose of the podcast, we can only kind of really surmise on that, right? Um, but in terms of where it's actually up to, kind of on this side of the wire. Yeah, like like the O3 thing that dropped last week or the week before. Someone finding a kernel vulnerability
yes, yes,
and
I do
making
remember that.
making use of O3 for that. Like
Mm,
it found the vulnerability autonomously. I think it was 7 or 8% of the time, and
mm,
really what happened was the researcher actually used it as a tool to kind of fit and kind of supercharge their own knowledge of how to get things done and then was able to like successfully complete that chain and weaponize and do all of that, right? um I think that's sort of where we're really up to when it comes to more complicated issues. I think on the flip side of that, if you're talking about go execute a pass the hash attack, like bounce around inside an internal network and get domain admin, like that's been happening for a while now. Like that's already kind of off the leash in terms of offensive deployment of LLMs. And yeah, to me, what that says to the whole reasoning ability of all this stuff with like 0 day or domain admin or root as a eval, right? Is
mm.
that it's very good at um, inferring what it should do next from what it's already been trained on, and things that it's seen actually generate success in the past as a function of its training data or whatever's in its RAG data set or whatever, right? But in terms of this whole like truly novel reasoning thing that like Apple was talking about, yeah, I kind of agree with the Apple paper in a lot of ways. I do think it's a little bit academic at the same time, because like your ability to reason is limited by what you know,
Yeah.
and that's going to vary based on the operator, right? So this whole even I get squawky about this even when the definition of AGI comes up, because it's like, well, according to who? Um,
Yeah. What
there's
is AGI?
there's lots of different ways
Yeah.
that you can kind of
Yeah.
decide to set the cut line on that, and this is
Yeah.
no exception to it. So yeah, look, I again, I think um it's really going to be a matter of these tools being worked on and refined around specific kind of domains of purpose. And then, for the better part, I think having human operators be the training source for that, and kind of the beneficiary of that. And ultimately, you'll see like learning loops where, the operators ultimately training the machine to get better, like DARPA and the AICC are doing a ton around that type of thing. Um, yeah, there's a whole lot going on. It hasn't, I mean, the sky hasn't fallen yet, I guess is probably my big call out there, but it
Yeah.
has in some ways, and I think will, in terms of its the acceleration of risk when it comes to like end day, and like not these like, oh, there's a SSH like unorth, Privesc or whatever else that you can kind of get from the outside that we found with AI, and there's hundreds of them everywhere, and we just don't know they're there. That might be true. I don't think AI is going to get us to that answer yet, but there's a whole bunch of bugs downstream from that are everywhere that it's very good at exploiting at this point. So, as a defender, that's what I'd be thinking about there.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Sounds good, Casey. We are very close to wrapping
I,
up. I
I feel
have a
like
question.
I feel like we've solved all of it though, so that's good. So,
Yeah, I think, yeah, only if conversations and ideas could solve problems in the world. I would be doing that every day, all day. But at least, like, we need more people to speak about these things, right? And sort of share how they're solving some of these challenges in their organizations and whatnot.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
no,
I think the directional signposts that I guess, as takeaways that I'm trying to throw up here is that if you're working on, like,
mm,
this is an area that I'm digging into a lot. There's a lot of interest in it from the venture side. I think there's a lot of interest in it, just in general from the market right now, and people that are working on it, like, share your research, reach out, do whatever.
yeah,
But also this idea of like, don't try to be all things to all people. I think narrowing down the set of goals you're trying to achieve with
yeah,
your systems, like, I think that's, for the
absolutely.
foreseeable future, gonna be the best way to approach actually creating value there.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's been my experience as well. Is if I try to solve too many things with AI, I absolutely fail in 100% of the cases. But on the other hand, if I know a problem really well, and if I try to solve it, using AI by giving
Yep.
it the right context, the right prompts, it can actually really solve difficult problems, challenges that I spend days, weeks on. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think focusing on a very niche or a very specific area and solving it in a way that works consistently and reliably every time, I think is going to be the key of how folks can build companies and whatnot. Right.
completely agree.
Awesome, Casey. I had a lot of other questions, but I think I'll have to have you again, like some point. But this has been a very wonderful conversation. So again, thank you so much for joining me in sort of discussing all things AI and cybersecurity. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for having me on, Anshuman. Good to see you again.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Juba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.